Welcome to the Englishstorywell channel, your ultimate destination for captivating stories that enhance your English learning journey. Here, we believe that stories are not just a form of entertainment, but a powerful tool to improve your language skills. Let's go to started.
Miss Adelaide was a very beautiful woman. Even though she was in her 60s, she looked much younger. Her hair was silver but shiny, and her face was soft, with smooth skin. People in the town always admired her, because she seemed to have never aged. Miss Adelaide lived alone in a large, old house that was once grand and elegant. The house had high ceilings, large windows, and a beautiful garden in the front. However, now it felt empty and lonely. Miss Adelaide was a proud woman, always dressed in the finest clothes, even when she had nowhere to go. She loved to look in the mirror and admire herself. Her beauty was her greatest treasure, and she wanted to hold on to it forever. Her nephew, Robert, lived with her. He was a young man in his early 20s, kind and gentle. Robert had lost his parents when he was a child, and Miss Adelaide had taken him in. However, she did not treat him with much kindness. She saw him as an inconvenience, a reminder of her fading youth, and often reminded him of how much he owed her for raising him. Robert was quiet, and he spent most of his time studying or taking care of the house. He didn't have many friends and rarely went out, as he was always busy with Miss Adelaide's demands. But Robert was patient, and despite the way she treated him, he felt sorry for his aunt. He knew she was lonely, even though she never admitted it. One afternoon, while Miss Adelaide was sitting in her living room, admiring a portrait of herself from her younger days, there was a knock on the door. Robert quickly went to open it. Standing there was a woman who looked about Miss Adelaide's age, but unlike Miss Adelaide, she didn't try to hide her wrinkles or gray hair. The woman smiled warmly at Robert and said, "Hello, my name is Mrs. Sutherland. I'm an old friend of your aunt. May I come in?" Robert, surprised, invited her inside and led her to Miss Adelaide. When Mrs. Sutherland entered the room, Miss Adelaide looked up, and her smile quickly faded. She didn't seem happy to see her old friend. "Adelaide, it's been so long," Mrs. Sutherland said, her voice full of joy. "Yes, it has," Miss Adelaide replied, but her tone was cold. Mrs. Sutherland didn't seem to notice Miss Adelaide's coldness. She sat down and began talking about old times. She reminisced about when they were young and would go to dances together. Mrs. Sutherland was full of life, laughing and smiling as she spoke. Miss Adelaide, however, was uncomfortable. She didn't like being reminded of the past. It made her feel as though her beauty was slipping away. She had always been the most beautiful woman in the room, and now, even though she still looked younger than her years, she couldn't help but feel the weight of time. As Mrs. Sutherland continued talking, she mentioned her grandchildren and how they brought her so much joy. "Adelaide, do you have any family?" she asked kindly. Miss Adelaide's face stiffened. "I have Robert, my nephew," she said, waving her hand dismissively in his direction. "But I don't have any children of my own." "Oh, that's too bad," Mrs. Sutherland said softly. "Family is such a blessing in our later years. I'm sure Robert takes good care of you, though." Miss Adelaide didn't respond. She was growing more uncomfortable by the minute. She didn't like the way Mrs. Sutherland seemed so happy with her life, wrinkles and all. Mrs. Sutherland didn't care about her appearance, and yet she was surrounded by family and love. Meanwhile, Miss Adelaide had spent her whole life protecting her beauty, but now, as she sat alone in her grand house, she felt emptier than ever. After Mrs. Sutherland left, Miss Adelaide stared at herself in the mirror. For the first time, she didn't see the beauty that she was so proud of. She saw a woman who was growing old, and the realization frightened her. Over the next few days, Miss Adelaide couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Sutherland's visit. She had spent so many years focusing on her looks, but what did she have to show for it? She had no real friends, no close family, and no one to care for her except Robert, whom she had always taken for granted. One morning, she called Robert into the living room. He came in, expecting another demand, but instead, she looked at him with a softness he had never seen before. "Robert," she said quietly, "I've been thinking." Robert was surprised. His aunt never spoke to him in such a gentle tone. "I realize that I haven't been kind to you," she continued. "I've been selfish, thinking only about myself and my beauty. But beauty doesn't last forever, does it?" Robert didn't know what to say. He had never heard his aunt speak like this before. "I'm sorry, Robert," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've spent too much time worrying about how I look and not enough time appreciating the people around me. I know I haven't treated you well, but I want to change that." Robert was moved by her words. He had always hoped that one day his aunt would see him for who he was, not just as someone to run errands for her. He smiled softly and said, "It's okay, Aunt Adelaide. I know you've been through a lot. I'm just glad you're here." Miss Adelaide felt a warmth in her heart that she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, she realized that her beauty didn't matter as much as she thought it did. What mattered was the people in her life and how she treated them. From that day on, Miss Adelaide made an effort to be kinder to Robert. She stopped looking in the mirror as often, and instead of spending hours on her appearance, she began to focus on other things. She started taking walks in the garden with Robert, where they would talk about everything from books to the weather. She realized that Robert was smart and kind, and she regretted not getting to know him sooner. One afternoon, Miss Adelaide decided to visit Mrs. Sutherland. She had avoided socializing for so long, but now she wanted to reconnect with people. When she arrived at Mrs. Sutherland's house, she was greeted with a warm hug. "Adelaide, it's so good to see you," Mrs. Sutherland said with a smile. Miss Adelaide smiled back. "It's good to see you too. I've been thinking about what you said the other day, about family and what really matters in life." Mrs. Sutherland nodded. "Yes, it's easy to get caught up in things that don't really matter. But in the end, it's the people around us who make life worth living." Miss Adelaide agreed. She felt lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in her life, she wasn't worried about her looks or what others thought of her. She was simply happy to be surrounded by people who cared about her. As time went on, Miss Adelaide became more involved in the community. She joined a group of women who met every week to talk and share stories. She reconnected with old friends and even made new ones. She realized that life was about more than just appearances. It was about love, kindness, and the connections we make with others. Robert noticed the change in his aunt, too. She was no longer critical or demanding. Instead, she was patient and understanding. They grew closer, and Robert felt like he finally had a family. One day, as they sat in the garden together, Miss Adelaide turned to Robert and said, "Thank you, Robert, for always being there for me. I didn't appreciate it before, but I do now." Robert smiled. "I'm just glad you're happy, Aunt Adelaide." Miss Adelaide looked around the garden, at the flowers blooming and the sun shining. She felt content. For the first time in her life, she understood what true happiness was. It wasn't about looking perfect or being admired by others. It was about being loved and loving others in return. And with that realization, Miss Adelaide finally felt at peace. Welcome to this engaging and captivating English story, The Lovely Lady, a perfect listening experience for intermediate learners looking to improve their English skills. This story is part of our Level 4 series, designed to challenge your vocabulary and comprehension while keeping the language simple and accessible. White Medium Star Story Summary. The Lovely Lady tells the story of Miss Adelaide, a once beautiful woman who has spent her entire life focused on her appearance. As she grows older, Miss Adelaide begins to realize that beauty fades, and the most important things in life are family, kindness, and human connections. With the help of her young nephew Robert and an old friend, she learns to appreciate the people around her and finds true happiness. This heartwarming story teaches valuable life lessons about love, humility, and aging with grace. Glowing Star: Why You Should Listen. Improve your listening skills with an engaging English story. Learn new vocabulary and expressions suitable for intermediate learners, Level 4. Enhance your comprehension and pronunciation by hearing the story read aloud. Practice shadowing and repeat the dialogue to build confidence in speaking. Ideal for learners looking to advance their English with storytelling. Blue Book: What You'll Learn. Listening practice. Listening to stories helps you understand natural speech patterns, improve your pronunciation, and expand your vocabulary. New vocabulary. Encounter useful words and phrases that are commonly used in English conversations. Comprehension skills. Strengthen your ability to follow complex narratives and understand the deeper meanings behind the story. Conversation insights. Learn how to use polite and everyday English in conversations, along with emotional expression. This audiobook format is a wonderful tool for anyone looking to build fluency in English. The simple yet meaningful story is easy to follow, making it perfect for those who want to enjoy an interesting tale while practicing their language skills. Lightbulb tips for learning. Listen carefully to the story once or twice without pausing to get the overall meaning. Practice shadowing by repeating what you hear immediately after the narrator. This will improve your speaking fluency. Focus on the vocabulary and try to use new words and phrases in your daily conversation. Review the story by summarizing it in your own words to check your understanding. Join us in this journey to improve your English fluency with captivating stories like The Lovely Lady. Enjoy the audiobook, practice your skills, and grow more confident in speaking English.